Hi there, and welcome to our last live stream for the Spring 2024 Full Bloom Watercolor Snacks box. I'm going to walk you through the steps for how to create a painting of I keep wanting to call it a zinnia, but I believe it's a dahlia flower. So I'm going to show you the different steps for creating this piece, starting with drawing, the process of masking, the painting, and then adding the paint to it. Quickly, I'm just going to touch on the supplies that I have. So if you want to grab the supplies and gather them together so that you can follow along, you're more than welcome to. I'm working primarily with materials that were featured in the Spring 2024 Watercolor Snacks box. So my surface is going to be this Fabriano hot press watercolor paper. I've actually cut down a piece to be 5x7. So I'm working a little bit smaller, but of course you can work any size that you like. I'm going to be working landscape orientation, which means that's the wide direction. So if you wanted to use a full piece of paper, you could just turn the paper to be landscape orientation. The paints I'm working with are these wonderful My Mary Blue Italian tube paints. They're really, really nice. And you get a lot of paint. They seem like they might be small, but a lot of paint is in these tubes because when you mix them with water, they go a lot further. And then I have my two brushes. I have the oval petal brush, which is appropriate for our theme of flowers and spring blooms, as well as the Princeton Velvet Touch round brush is the size 4. So this one is a little bit bigger, has a little bit more width to it, but you can also get some pretty fine detail with the point. And the round brush is also really great for detailed work. And then two other items that came in the box. This is a spray bottle. I have just plain water in it. I use it for reactivating my paint in my palette, but you can also absolutely use this for different effects on your paper, or getting your paper wet first before you apply paint to it. So there's a lot that you can do with a spray bottle. And then the last thing that came in the box is this washi tape that I designed that has little honeybees on it. This is optional if you have masking tape. Although if you don't have masking tape, this is a great option for what we're going to be working on today. And then a couple extra things. I have my ceramic palette that I'll use to mix my paints on. I have an X-Acto knife and a pair of scissors on here. So I can use this for cutting the masking tape that I'm going to use. I also use this to help me remove the masking tape. So these are going to be helpful tools. I have blue painter's tape, but really any kind of masking tape you have will do. Just mind that this tape will vary in stickiness. So the painter's tape is meant to be peeled off, so that's why I like to use it. But certain masking tapes have more tack to it. So just maybe test it on a piece of paper, and if it seems to have a lot of tack, you can sort of I'll pat it down on a piece of fabric like my shirt or pants, and that will help remove some of the stickiness. So I'll show you how to do that. I have pencil with me, so for sketching, that will be really handy. I have this really awesome Plumchester pencil. If you don't know, Plumchester is the ArtSnacks brand. So this is a really nice pencil. I believe, can't remember if it came in the bookmark kit or the travel kit. Both kits are awesome. So this is a good pencil for that. And the last two things I have are just paper towels that I always keep handy. And I have two containers for water so that I can clean my brush. So that is a quick overview of everything I'm going to be working with today. So I'm just going to move some things out of my way and get to my paper.
Amelia, we do have a student that joined us. Jess is here.
Excellent. Yay! I'm glad you're here,
Welcome.
Jessica. Welcome. Awesome. Okay. Well, you haven't missed much. All I did was just kind of go over the materials that I brought with me to work on today. So if you need a minute to gather up some tools, no problem, take your time. Otherwise, you can follow along with me. So I have my paper and I'm just gonna bring my camera in a little bit since I'm working a little smaller. So zoom in and just arrange a little here. Okay, so I'm just gonna pull up really quick. I have on my iPad over here. There we go. Oh, I can't enter my code right. Sorry about that. Okay, so this is the reference image that I'm working with. So this is a dahlia flower, I believe. I haven't quite identified it. I'm torn between dahlia and zinnia. It's somewhere in that family, but you can see that this has a lot of petals, and it seems like it might feel a little intimidating to tackle all those petals, but don't worry, I'm going to show you a trick to kind of simplify the overall shape, and also a way that I found it to be a little bit easier to keep everything symmetrical. So you'll draw a very loose sketch of the petals, but it won't be super detailed, just enough to kind of give you a sense of where you'll want to add your paint for the flower and where you'll add your tape to mask off the flower. So the overall composition has this pretty close to the center. It's not exactly in the center. So I'm just gonna start with a sketch of a circle like that. And then you notice that the petals all are kind of radiating out from the center. So I'm just gonna use some guidelines really lightly to sketch out the radius of where those petals will go. So I'm kind of, it's almost like drawing a target shape. And looking at my reference image, I have kind of a central part of the flower. That's where the petals are emerging from the center. And then I've got about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, about 5, not really rows of petals, but 5 layers of radiating petals. So we'll do about 1, 2, 3. I'm probably going to do about 4. And this is just enough, like I said, to kind of give me a guideline of where my petals are going to go. Okay, so I'm going to start in the center, and I'm using just some curved lines to where all the petals are meeting in the inside. And the shape that I'm using is just kind of like almost a pointy fish scale sort of shape. So it's like a half circle, but it comes to a point where you could even think of it as almost like half a lemon or something like that. And I have them all facing in. And I'm just going to repeat that shape going around the center. Because again, these petals are all kind of overlapping onto themselves, and it's much more dense in the center here, where they're all still unfolding from where they were inside the closed up flower bud. And again, I'm not really being terribly detail oriented based off of what I see in the reference image, because this sketch is just a framework for me later in the painting. It won't really be visible after I add the paint. So you don't have to worry too much about how it looks. This isn't necessarily a drawing project. It's more just to give you something to work off of when you get to the painting stage. So after you are finished with this part that's in the middle, that's when it starts to change a little bit. That's that transition of the petals opening up a little bit more. So now I'm starting to change the direction of the petals to where they're facing out. And I'm drawing the petals kind of curving out a little. So do your best to kind of follow the shape of the petals. But some of them are going to be unfolded a little bit more than others. And again, it's not imperative that you get this perfectly right. Just do your best so that you know when you get to the painting phase where everything will be. Okay, and then after you're done that layer that's kind of a transition layer, the petals will all follow a pretty similar shape. So again, it's that petal shape, kind of like half a lemon. And they don't have to be perfectly even. Just try to keep them generally the same size and shape so that your flower is relatively symmetrical. And I'm using, so the circles we drew earlier, I'm kind of using that as the place where I know to stop the top of the petal. And it's okay if it overlaps it, but that gives me a overall guide for the scale of each petal. And before I go too far over on this side here, there's in the reference image, there's a little unblossomed flower bud over here. So I'm just going to draw another circle, and that's going to represent where that flower bud's going to go. And then there's some leaves. So these are just bigger petal shapes. Include that in there. And then just kind of finish out this last row. Okay, so I have a pretty general shape, a pretty general sketch. One thing I did forget to grab was an eraser. So if you don't have one and you want to grab one, you can go ahead and do that now, or you can just leave the sketch how it is. But I just grabbed a kneaded eraser. I really like those a little more than the hard rubber erasers, just for the purpose of lightening up the sketch. I do think the hard rubber erasers are better for totally removing any line work, but I'm just gonna kind of lighten up some of the heavier lines that I definitely don't want. Because I don't really mind if some of the sketch lines are still left behind in my painting that are of the flower, but I don't want my guidelines showing. So I'm just kind of very gently erasing out the guideline, those radial circles I drew earlier. And then I'm just gonna kind of lightly tap my drawing just to pull up some of the pencil marks. Okay, you don't need to do too much, just enough to kind of lighten it up a little so when you add your paint, it's not super heavy. Okay, so this part's going to take a little time, but I do think it's worth it. I'm going to show you a masking method just using tape. So this is a pretty straightforward way if you want to do layers of a painting and you want to paint a background, but you want to try to keep detailed areas from getting having paint overlapping into areas you don't want. And since I'm going to be working with kind of complementary colors, green and a sort of magenta pink color, it's not terrible if they mix, but if they do in a way that I don't want, since they're complements, they'll kind of create a muddy color that I might not like. So I'm going to use the masking technique to delineate the shapes a little more. So I'm just going to use this painter's tape and I'm gonna pull off a piece. Now, if you're working with smaller tape, um, you you can follow the same sort of method of adding tape that I'm going to add, but it might take a little bit longer because the tape is smaller. So just as a heads up, it might be taping for a little bit longer than I am, but that's okay. Because you can always come back to this and follow along after, or just keep working as at your own pace. Or if you're rewatching, you can pause it. So I'm kind of tapping, I don't know if you can see me over in the corner. I'm tapping my tape onto a blanket so that it pulls off some fuzz and takes away some of the stickiness. I don't want it to be so sticky that it rips my paper. So I'm starting with kind of a bigger piece and I'm going to trim some of the edges off. And rather than trying to cut my tape perfectly to fit everything, I'm just going to kind of tape over the biggest parts in the middle, and then I'll do more detailed pieces of tape on the outside. I think that is more, it's a better use of time in terms of taping everything. So I'm gonna de-stickify my tape a little and trim it down. And again, and it's okay if the tape overlaps. You can create a thick layer of tape as you need. And I'm just gonna repeat that process so I can cover this whole shape. And again, the nice thing is too, you can rearrange the tape as you need to. And you do want to press it down, because if any edges are lifting up, the paint is going to seep underneath of that. So I'm going to try to make sure that you have it covered pretty well. And then what I'm going to do is just trim down a little, work with some smaller pieces to start to build out closer to the edges. This. So I think the trick is try to cover up the big spaces as much as you can. And then that makes it easier so you're not having to do as many little tiny parts. And then what you can do also, now another option, which I don't trust myself to do, but you might want to try it, is if you wanted to put some tape down and then use an X-Acto to cut the tape off around the shapes, you can absolutely do that. You need a really sharp blade for that. But I tend to press down a little too hard and then cut the paper. So you can try it if you think that you'd be able to have the patience to very slowly and gently cut through the tape and not the paper. But that's why I opted for the scissors because I think I just do a little bit of a better job with doing it that way. But there's more than one way to do it, and you might be like me and prefer to use the scissors, or maybe you want to try an X-Acto because you can get more precise that way. And I'm not terribly worried about precision as long as it's close enough. That's good enough for me. So, but yeah, just kind of cut out the general shapes that I'm working with the tape, and then that way I can kind of build out the shapes a little better that way. Let's try the X-Acto. I'm just gonna trim off this little edge. I will show you what I use the X-Acto for a little later on. It was really helpful with removing the tape. So if you have one handy, it is really good for that, I will say. Okay. So now this is the part that's a little more tedious, but I think it's pretty fun, especially if you kind of like cutting things out and putting them on paper. This is like a very impermanent collage almost. But I'm just gonna pull a big piece of tape. I'm gonna de-stickify it on my fuzzy blanket. And then I am going to trim it down a little, and then just start to cut out some general petal shapes. Now, don't worry too much about getting it to be the exact same size. If you end up cutting it a little bit bigger, that's totally fine because then you can cover more space that way. So that's kind of what I did when I painted our example, which is posted on Mix. And is tucked into a book in my backpack. I didn't grab it out of there, but yeah, I just kind of generally cut out some petal shapes with scissors and then just taped it along the flower, just like this. So I'm just going to continue this method, and some of the petals might be closer together than others. It's okay because in nature, I mean, they're pretty darn symmetrical, but as an organic thing, it's not always totally perfect. So it's okay if the flower in your painting is not totally perfect either. I know where I live, we've had a lot of hot weather. I know a lot of people have experienced that, but we've definitely had very hot and humid weather. It's always humid here in Maryland, but our humidity was very, very high this past week. But I bring that up because it's fitting for our full bloom box, because as a result of all of that humidity, my vegetable garden has gone totally bananas and has been putting out tons and tons of um, blossoms for the tomatoes, and I have butternut squash planted, and I already have some little squash coming in, which is very exciting because I am a huge fan of butternut squash soup. So I think I'll have more soup than I know what to do with soon enough. But it's been nice, even though it has been very uncomfortable to be outside, and I've been hiding inside um, these past several days. The plants are very happy, so that's good. And they're in full bloom for sure. So that is very exciting. And I even have some tomatoes coming in, which I guess it's about tomato season, so it's not unusual. But yeah, they're starting to really come in. And I have what's called volunteers for those gardeners out there. You know what I'm talking about. But if you don't, a volunteer is a plant that pops up that you didn't plant in the garden. It's from leftover from seeds that fell the previous season. And my tomato, I have a lot of tomato volunteers. So um, they're growing outside of my garden too. They're kind of coming up out of the edges of the raised bed. So,
Amelia, that is so funny that you say that
oh
because
yeah.
I also have a volunteer tomato plant.
Oh, you do?
It's co-mingling with the green beans, and I have no idea how it got there.
Ah, that's so funny.
But yeah, they are also in full bloom. They're doing very well.
Oh, I'm glad. I'm glad to hear that. Yeah, it's so funny. I know some people will pull them out of the ground, but I keep them. I say the more tomatoes, the better. I'll say that now, and then I'll be up to my eyeballs in tomatoes. I'll be like, why did I wish this? My next door neighbors always have some kind of plant growing in the middle of their yard or on the edges of like a really weird part of their yard, which I think is so cool. And they have a corn stalk growing because they planted corn last season. So they have a big corn stalk growing, and it's right at the edge of our driveway. So I'm always greeted by the corn. Hello, corn, I'm home. But I liked when they grew corn last year. They kind of planted it almost like it was almost like a fence between our yards. But I liked the sound of a breeze or the wind blowing through the corn. It's very relaxing. And maybe this is because I grew up around cornfields. But I'm like, ah, the sound of corn. But I do think it's pleasant. So again, as you can see, as I'm taping down, I'm not too concerned about the overall shape of the petals. Um, Especially because if I need to fill in the edges between the petals and the backgrounds, I can. So if there's some extra white space that I don't want, or if I need to make the petal wider or the background coming closer, I can do that after. So um, it's not the end of the world if everything's not perfectly lined up. And you can always add more tape or take tape away as needed. And you'll see I'm kind of trying to use as much tape as I can. I don't want to waste the piece of tape. So I'll try to cut out in between the shapes that I cut previously. So just do your best with it. I think also it kind of helps to have a thicker layer of tape because it makes it a little easier to peel off later. Although I will say, because you're getting the tape wet from the watercolor paint, it does peel off pretty easily. You just want to try to let it dry pretty thoroughly before you start peeling it off. Only because you don't want to rip the paper. I might pull mine off a little sooner than I normally would, only just for the sake of time, but definitely be sure if you're using tape on your painting to let everything totally dry. We're almost there. It seems like it would take a really long time, but I think you can get through it pretty quick if you're not super meticulous. I left the edges kind of pointy, but you could always round them out like that too. So if you don't, if you want to do a different shape, you are more than welcome to do that. I personally really like doing things like this that are, I don't want to say tedious, but they're repetitive is maybe a better way to say it. Because you don't have to think too hard about it. You just repeat the motions until you're done. So I kind of like when projects have steps that, you just have to repeat the same step over and over. I also like stippling, that style of art making for the same reason. I just wish I had more time in life. I think we all feel that way, but more time in life to just sit down and do meticulous steps like this. This one to fit this petal, it curves up. Okay, just a couple more, and then we'll move on to our next stage, which is painting the background. So we're in the home stretch now. Extra tape seems to build up on the inside of my scissors. And one more piece of tape, and I don't think it needs to be that big. Probably. So for those of you who have been in the last couple of the streams since May, my little studio assistant, my kitten, I named her Gremlin, she's in here. She's sleeping on the job, which is actually a good thing because she's got that kitten energy. So she is always running around and bouncing off the walls and driving my poor older cat, Cooper, out of his mind. Because he likes to just lay around, sit in the sun and look out the window and take naps. And he'll be trying to take his daily nap or do his daily surveillance of watching the birds and squirrels out the window. And she'll jump up and try to grab his tail or try to get in his face and play with him. And he's like, leave me alone. But they do get along for the most part. I think he just has a low tolerance, but this is a rare moment where she is sleeping. So I will definitely enjoy the quiet while she's being good, because I think if she were awake, she would not be able to resist investigating what I'm doing. And she would definitely want to help out with the taping portion of this project. Okay, I think this looks pretty good. So I have, for the most part, masked off everything that I don't want to paint just yet. I will be painting it later, but for now, I want to keep that part separate from painting the background. And the technique that I'm going to use for painting the background is really loose and washy, and then in the middle, it's going to be a little more detailed. So I wanted to kind of make sure that I could have the freedom to really get loose and messy, while without having to be really vigilant of keeping the edges clear so that they were defined. So we go back, I'm going to pull up my reference image again. So in this photo, it's using a shallow depth of field. So our flower is really detailed and crisp. And for the most part, you can see all the petals and all the detail there. But then in the background, it's really blurred because that's not where the focus is. So I'm gonna use a really loose wash in the background, and that is going to fill out our background. And you can see how, that could be challenging with trying to get all these distinct edges. So now I can paint and add a lot of color, and when I peel the tape off, those edges will be preserved. So I just want to show you my palette. Now, these are the paints I used for this painting when I was working on it before. So I am going to add a little more paint, and I'm going to use, actually, I'm going to reactivate some of the paint that's on here using my spray bottle. But I do want to add a little more of some colors. So I think I need actually a little more of this, the green gold. That I'm just gonna add a little bit. And I think that's a good start. And then I'll just keep these handy in case I need to mix up some more colors. So in the previous painting, I started out just with a layer of the green gold. So I am going to just add a little water to this so that it'll flow. I don't want it to be too heavy paint. Actually, I might, since I have the spray bottle, I think I'm gonna, because I want the paper to be a little damp. I'm just gonna spray the paper. And then I'll use my petal brush. Trying to let you see a little more what I'm doing. I'm just wiping off my paintbrush. And then take some clean water and just spread that spray bottle water out a little. Don't want it to be too puddly. So you don't want too much water on there because otherwise you'll get puddles, especially around the edges where your paper might be curling like mine. So you want to kind of be mindful of the amount of moisture on your paper. And you might be familiar with this because I've covered it before, but what I'm doing is called the wet and wet technique. So you want enough moisture on your paper so that when you add the paint onto the paper, it flows really evenly. But again, you don't want it to be so damp that you're getting puddling happening in areas that you don't want it to. So I'm just going to go in and start adding in some washes of paint. And I'm going to pull up my reference image again so I can see, because there's a mix of this sort of light green. Now this is a different green than what's in the reference image, but I think that's okay because we'll build up layers of color. But if you wanted to color match a little bit more, definitely mixing in some blue with this green and maybe a little bit of the Payne's gray would help to darken it up and cool it down. Because right now this is very warm. But I'm just trying to put down a base layer of color. And I'm also kind of adding a sort of a, not really sure how to describe my brush stroke, but I'm kind of using a circular motion here because I'm aiming for an organic type of look. I want it to look a little bit like there might be rounded trees or bushes in the background. All right, so I'm gonna try to mix this a little quickly because I want to work on this while it's still wet, but I'm gonna pull some of this blue. This is an ultramarine blue. This is where I mixed this color last time. So pulling some of that blue, you'll pull some of this green gold. And then just a touch of the Payne's gray just to make it a little darker. And now you can see I've mixed up a nice darker green. And I'm just gonna go in and lay in some areas in the background. And I want to blend them out a little. So I'm just gonna take a brush with some clean water and use that to start to feather out the edges.
Hey, Amelia,
Yeah,
just wanted to give you a heads up. You are halfway through class.
great, thank you.
No problem.
And I'm just kind of going back and forth here with a little bit of the green gold and just kind of blending the colors together. And the reference image, there's a little bit of a pink flower down here. Last time I brushed a little and added it while the green was still wet. So I'm gonna wait until it's a little more dry before I add in that flower in the background. So as you can see, I'm just kind of using some loose brush strokes, kind of using little circles a little bit to almost blend in, scrub together those colors in the background. And I'm also thinking about there's some shapes like in the background, there's a stem. So loosely paint in that stem. Main thing I'm kind of going for is just not to have too many hard, distinct edges. Because in the background in our reference image, they're all just kind of colors blurring together. And you don't have to be super faithful to the reference image either. So if you want to add something more particular to the background, you're more than welcome to. I have to go back in and add my stem. I accidentally painted over it. That's okay. And you can work in layers here. So, if you find that it's drying really light somewhere you want it to be darker, you can always go back in and add in more color. But I'm just I'm just tapping in the paint with my brush a little bit. That. And bring my stem back mostly. And then take my other brush, my more narrow brush, and then take a tiny bit of this magenta and add in the stem. It's the stems in our reference image are kind of a similar reddish color to the petals that we have, and it's gonna blend a little bit if you are painting wet into wet. So just be mindful that your colors will blend. And if you don't want them to do that, wait till it dries a little more. But if you like that effect, then that's how you achieve that look. Which makes sense because it's meant to be soft and blurry and out of focus. Like that. And you can always go in and define it a little bit more as it dries. I'm going to take a damp, clean brush, I should say, and just soften out some edges a little. Again, it's kind of almost like a scrubby technique. Your clean brush, just kind of soften out those edges. Now your brush has to be not totally dry, but also not have a lot of water on it because you don't want it to lift up too much. You just want to kind of lift up a little bit of those edges so that they're softer. Because when you're doing this, it is going to pull some of the paint off of your paper. So just be mindful that you're not removing something that you don't want to. Okay. Oops. I was just testing to see how dry it was and I ended up leaving a fingerprint in it. Be too impatient. Okay. So I'm gonna let this dry just a little bit before I add that pink area where there's gonna be a flower. So let's look at our reference image in the meantime. And I'll talk a little bit about the next steps we'll take after this dries a little. So I'm gonna add in down here. You see there's this sort of blurry pink background flower that blends into the back. So I'm gonna add that in, and then I think once I have that flower in, I'm gonna go through the process of peeling off the tape. So my advice would be to let the background fully dry before you peel the tape off. But for the sake of time, I will be removing the tape probably before it's totally dry. So be patient, give yourself some time, and you'll be less likely to accidentally rip your paper because it's in a vulnerable state when it's wet. And when you're removing the tape, it's more likely that you might damage the paper. Or if you're impatient, and you have something like a hair dryer or a heat gun, something like that, you can always use that on your paper, and that will help the process of drying a little bit more quickly, so that you can move on to the next step. Okay, that feels pretty good. So I'm going to take a little bit of that magenta. Part of why I picked this picture was because I loved that it had this beautiful magenta color, which we have in this color palette. I was like, oh, how perfect. That fits in exactly with the colors that we have. So I thought that was really nice. Now I'm using a technique I've showed you guys before where I'm pressing down with my brush to create the petal shape, which is perfect for this appropriately named and shaped brush, being the petal brush. So I'm able to use that to create petal shapes. And you can see since I'm using a red on green, it is creating a sort of brown color. So to circumvent that issue, you could always tape off that area as well. Or you could even use your brush to lift out some color and reapply it as well. But I think it's okay for it to blend a little bit because I think the flowers themselves also have areas where they're blending green and magenta. So I think it works just fine. I'm going to use because this is pretty crisp, I'm just using my other brush to, again, just soften out the edges. Because they're not quite that sharp. I think another thing you could do that I hadn't really thought of until now would be you could, before you add the magenta, would be to lift out some of that green with some water and a paper towel. So you could start to blot out the color. That's another option. So if you didn't want so much green coming through, that would also work pretty well. But yeah, just kind of blending it out a little, especially over here. I added a little more space than what's in the photo, so I'm just gonna kind of blend that out. Okay. Now again, my advice would be to let this dry a little more fully, but I want to get to the process of painting the flower. So I want to leave time for that. And I also want to show you my technique for removing the tape. So again, if your paper is still feeling damp, maybe let it dry a little longer or use something to dry it so that your paper is more sturdy when you go to take the tape off. But I have an X-Acto knife. If you don't have an X-Acto knife, something similar, like if you happen to have a palette knife or even something like, ideally something flat, maybe a pair of nice sharp tweezers could work. Or if you're really careful, you could use a push pin, but that is a little more difficult. But essentially just something to kind of get under the tape and help you push it up so that you're not digging your fingernail into your paper and potentially damaging your paper or smudging the paint if it's not fully dry, that kind of thing. So that's why I like to use the X-Acto, and because it's flat and sharp, so you can slide it underneath of your tape and then you can start to lift the tape off. This is like the ultimate tape peel. So this will be, I think, fun to watch. And it's fun to peel. And you might find that some of your edges aren't perfectly even, and that's okay. You can always clean that up with a clean, damp paintbrush, or you can just kind of paint over it with your next color. And just take your time with this part too. Don't want to rush through this and accidentally rip your paper. I also like using the X-Acto knife because I personally think it's good to try not to touch your paper too much, because especially with watercolor painting, at least this is some of the experience I've had, the oil from your fingers can affect the application of the materials. So try to avoid touching your paper too much. Ah, that was a super satisfying last peel, getting all the petals off at once. I'm glad that came out in one. So I think this actually worked pretty well this time. Just a little bit of um areas where the paint seeped underneath and gave me kind of a bit of a rougher edge. But overall, I think that worked pretty nicely. So I might go in and actually just erase out a little more of the pencil personally, especially now that not everything is perfectly aligned. I'm just gonna clean up the sketch lines a little more here. Okay. Some of the areas that were still a little heavy. Okay, so this is where the petal brush can really shine, because it is, well, you're painting a bunch of petals, so it's like fulfilling its destiny of painting petals. Um, but from here, what I'm gonna do, and let's actually, before I jump in, let's just take one more look at our reference photo so you can see what I'm looking at. So this flower has some white tips around it. So I'm gonna try to preserve some of those areas where the white edges of the petals are. So when I'm approaching this, I'm gonna kind of fill in the center of the petal and leave some white edges around. So you know, with watercolor, any areas that you want to preserve as white, you can either mask or you have to just plan ahead and make sure that you don't accidentally paint over top of them. And then I also have my little green flower bud here. So I'm also going to fill that in as well. So I'm going to take some of that nice, actually, I think I might have, did I add other colors to this last time? Let's see. So, I feel like it came out kind of dark. I think I mixed some colors in there. So I'm going to add a little more. Add a little more of that. And this is the quinacridone lake, but I've been calling it magenta because it's kind of that magenta color. Okay, grab a little bit. And now I'll show you what I was talking about. So I'm not going to go quite all the way to the edge. And I'm also going to try not to overlap with petal that it meets. So I want to try to leave the tips of the flowers white, or tips of the petals white. And it's a little thick, so I'm going to water it down a little more. And again, I'm just going to kind of keep repeating this process throughout. I'm working from the outside in, although I may jump around a little bit depending on where I am within the petals. And the brush stroke that I'm using, I'm kind of using a quick flicking motion just to quickly fill in the shape. I'm also primarily for the detailed areas using the tip of the brush so that I have a little more control over how much paint is applied. So you could also, if you felt a little more comfortable using the round brush, you could use that as well. But here's what it'll look like when I start the next row. So again, just trying to keep the top part white because the petals are white, but I think that also helps define the shapes of the petals so they don't blend into each other. So that's what that will look like. But I'm going to finish out this row, this outer row. And this can be just the first layer of the petals. So if you want to go in and add more definition later, you can definitely do that. I'll probably go in and add some definition to some of the petals, and I'll probably mix a little bit of Payne's Gray in with the quinacridone lake, and that will darken it up just enough so I can add some shadow or a little more definition to some areas that are, especially where the petals are overlapping. And just like with the background, it's okay if you're not totally precise. Again, especially if you weren't terribly precise with the drawing part, which is totally fine. I know I wasn't. You can kind of just improvise a little bit with how you're filling in the petals as well. I tend to improvise a lot when I am doing a painting, especially working from a reference image. 'Cause like I said, you're not a camera, so your interpretation of what you're seeing, if it's not exactly the same, that I think is more interesting to me as a viewer of art, because I like to be able to see the artists, how they see something or how they approach a painting versus, um, creating something that's exactly like what they saw. Not that that isn't super impressive. I do think that's pretty amazing, but it's not the only way to make something really good. So there's lots of ways to make really beautiful artwork, and it doesn't have to be exactly what you see. But you can see also, I'm just kind of generally following my sketch of the petal, but I'm not even, too concerned about getting the shape to be totally petal shaped even. Just as long as it's starting to look like a flower. I think that's really where we want to be. And then we're almost at the center where it's primarily white, so we can start to add a little less color, but there's still some around the edges, especially on this um, layer that's kind of in the middle. And we'll go back and just take a peek at my reference. Okay, so we still have some pink. Mhm. But I'm getting a little more sparse with it since we don't have as much. And now I'm just kind of almost creating hatch marks with this pointy part of the brush, the tip of it. And just using less and less and suggesting some color. Okay, now we'll come back to this middle part to add a little more definition so that doesn't get lost. But while the flower petals are drying, I'm gonna hop over to the flower bud. So I'm gonna take a little more of this. Let me move this so you can see what I'm mixing. A little more of the yellow gold, the green gold, I mean. A little more of this gray and a touch more of the ultramarine blue. And I'm just mixing up that kind of dark green again. Actually, I'm gonna add a touch of yellow to that. I'll warm it up a little bit, but not too much. Okay, I'm gonna take that. So that's the green that I mixed. And now I'm just going to, with my brush stroke, follow the shape of the petal. So going along with the overall shape of the drawn petal here. And I'm going to do the same for the flower bud. So again, using curved brush stroke. All right, now before that dries, I'm going to take a tiny bit of my pink and I'm just going to draw along the bottom here because in our reference image, we have just a little bit of pink petals peeking out. So I wanted to include that as well. And I can even take my round brush and a little water. And what I'm doing is erasing in a highlight. Okay. And while that part's drying now, I'll just hop back over to the petals and I'm just going to add another layer. Well, actually, before I do that, just for the sake of time, I want to take I'm going to take my round brush and a little bit of that same green that I just mixed up. And now I'm going to kind of draw into the center some green because in our image, we have that little green center part where it's the center of the flower, which has a name I can't remember off the top of my head. I'll fill that in. And then I'll just take some of the pink and define some of these details here to show that there are petals so they don't get totally lost. And I'll let a little bit of that pink blend in with the green. I think it looks pretty cool. And I'll just kind of do that with the rest of the petals. So this is where it's handy to have those pencil lines, even though they're light, because now I can kind of trace over them a little with my fine brush. This is a really good skill to practice, just kind of drawing with a paintbrush. Because then it helps you to do detail stuff like this.
Hey, Amelia, Sarah hopping in here.
Hey,
You've got about 15-ish minutes left.
awesome. Well, while I'm working on this, because I'm just going to continue to fill in and go over some of the areas of detail, the same technique. If anybody wanted to share what they were working on or had questions or anything, you're welcome to do that also. But no pressure. It's only if you really want to. I'm actually going to I'm going to mix a little um, of the magenta that I'm using with some Payne's gray because I want it to be a little darker so I have more contrast between the petals. So I'm using a little bit of a darker color. And it looks like this. It almost looks like a purple. Because remember, with watercolor, we have what's called the drying shift. So our colors are always going to look lighter when they dry than when we initially put them on.
Hey, Amelia, I just want to read a comment in the
Sure.
comments from Jess. She's still working on the background, and we'll try to remember to post on Mix when
Oh, yeah.
you're done. So
Great. Yeah,
we always
please do.
encourage that.
Excellent. Yeah, thank you. And yeah, please do post on Mix. No problem. I'm glad you're not rushing. Because I know I'm working pretty quickly because I wanted to get towards the finished product so you could see overall what it will look like and the techniques I'm using. But please do take your time and work at your own pace. Or even if you're just hanging out and watching or maybe working on something else, if you don't want to share tonight, you're always welcome to share in Mix. I love to see what you guys are working on. Okay. So I'm just kind of, again, going through and really loosely adding in some blocks of color. Like that. And then I want to jump over back to our little flower bud because I want to add some details in there too. So I'm taking a little bit of Payne's gray and dropping that into that green mixture that you saw me make earlier. And now I'm just gonna kind of go over where there's edges of petals as they're folded over, and just add some veins to the leaves. Just a little detail here and there, and then a little bit of shadow just to help give it some form. And I'm using some almost like hatch marks along the bottom here, and I'll add a little over the top. And these marks are following with the form, so the curvature of the overall shape, because there's a little bit of a highlight where the light's hitting it here. And then I do want to soften it out a little. So again, just going to take a clean but damp brush, and I'm going to just kind of soften those edges so it's not so stark. And that will make it look like it's seamlessly blending with that. And I'll add just a little more contrast in some areas. So now I'm just adding just a little bit of the Payne's gray, and I'm just going in and adding a couple little loose brush strokes, and that's just to add a little more definition to certain areas where you can tell that the petals are separate from each other, so they're not all blending into one big mass. Okay. So I feel like this is pretty close to being done. I don't want to overwork the painting. So now I'm going to go in and again with my round brush, I am taking a little bit of Payne's gray, and I'm going to add my signature down at the bottom. And I think that is wrapped up. So I don't know if anyone decided they wanted to share something, you're welcome to do so. But otherwise, I think this feels pretty good. I think this one's finished.
I love it.
Thank you.
Remind me, Amelia, is this hot press paper?
Yes, this is the Fabriano hot press.
Got it. It looks so like soft, and I know that's
Mhm.
mainly because there's not as much texture in hot press as there is in cold press. Do you
Yeah,
like this paper?
I do. I'm partial to hot press paper. Um,
Mm,
I feel like sometimes it's a little challenging for me to blend on because it's so smooth. Um, I think just because I'm like trying to corral the water because the surface is so slick that it will kind of slide everywhere versus I think cold press it. You can kind of it gets trapped in the texture a little more. Um,
right.
but I really like being able to go over this with colored pencil after.
Ooh, that's a good idea.
Mhm.
Interesting. Not water soluble pencil, colored pencil, just
Yeah,
regular
just
colored pencil.
regular colored pencil. Usually will use that as like a final layer of things, but the water soluble pencil is really fun too, especially on hot press.
Cool. I love it.
Thank you.
Anybody feel like sharing? You do not have to if you don't want to. I guess I will take this time now to give everyone a heads up of a couple of announcements. I'll say that. Oh, first, Jess, I enjoyed practicing with the pedal brush. Looking forward to getting the actual pedals with it.
Yay. I'm glad.
That makes complete sense. Um, the Okay, so the first announcement is Amelia and I are going to be doing a watercolor swatch party
Mhm.
on Wednesday, the 17th, so next Wednesday. That is on YouTube, so be on the lookout for links for that. Um, we're just going to be swatching out and painting and talking about watercolor.
Yeah.
Pretty much it.
Yeah.
It's gonna be great. So I highly recommend you join us. It'll be recorded, so if you don't make it, that's totally fine too. You
Mhm.
can watch it again on our YouTube channel. And the other thing that I wanted to bring up is that starting next box, so this is the spring box. Next box is the summer box. It's coming out first week of August. Um, That box will include live streams. However, they are going to be on a different platform. We're moving to YouTube,
Yay.
which is very exciting. It is the quality is much higher. It is easier and more accessible for people like you guys to watch and participate and so on. We love Zoom, but Zoom does not have everything that we want to do, nor does it have the quality of video that we want. So we will still post on Mix all the links to the YouTube channel. In fact, you can go to the YouTube now and see like a whole lineup of live streams that are upcoming. Um, so yeah, it's a bit of an adjustment because there won't be any more show and tell. We'll just be encouraging people to go to Mix. But for the most part, we think it's going to be a very positive change, primarily for the quality, the ease of use for the artists, for us, but also accessibility for anybody. You do not need to have a YouTube account to watch anything on YouTube, which is beautiful. So how do you feel about it, Amelia?
I'm excited. I'm really looking forward to it. And I'm hoping that, like you're saying, we'll be able to open this up to more people and get to see more artwork, which I'm excited about, of people
Mm.
posting in mix. So I think it's a good thing.
Oh, yeah. Awesome. All right. Well, with that said, I am going to close out class tonight. So thank you, Amelia, for your time. This is beautiful.
Oh, thank you. And thank you all
And
for coming.
yeah, thank you for those who came live. And yeah, this will be dropped on the Mix page probably on Monday or Tuesday.
Great. Thank
Woo.
you.
All right, everyone, have a great weekend.
Bye.